Hey y'all, so today I'm going to be talking about my bookish buzzwords as well as a few things that can deter me from reading a book. A few years ago I made a video entitled Book Turn-Ons and Turn-Offs where I basically talked about my bookish buzzwords and some things that would make me not want to pick up a book, and that's a bit outdated at this point. There are definitely some things that I don't necessarily agree with in that video, so I figured I would update it, and I've also, in collaboration with this video, done a video about how my general reading habits and tastes have changed over the years. I posted that earlier this week, so if you want to check that out, I will leave that linked up in the cards. But today I'm going to be talking about my bookish buzzwords, the specific things where if I hear that a book has this thing, I immediately want to pick it up. Like I said, some of these things are the same from a few years ago, but there are definitely some new things and some things that have been taken off of my list, so let's just go ahead and jump into this. And I'll be talking about the book turn-offs at the end of the video. There's only a few of those, but I'm saving those till the end. So in that video a few years ago, I think that I said that the #1 bookish turn-on for me, or bookish buzzword, was fantasy dystopians. I really enjoy fantasy dystopians. I love the hybrid. It's just something that I really, really enjoy. For me, this is no longer my #1 bookish turn-on. It's not like I hear that something's a fantasy dystopian and I immediately want to read it, but it's still something I really enjoy. And honestly, for me, lately, I've been kind of wanting to do a discussion on the term dystopian and what exactly that means, because I feel like there's the genre dystopia, but there are also these key traits that aren't necessarily inherent in the description of what a dystopian is, but if you don't have them in a dystopian, it doesn't feel like a dystopian. I'm not sure if that just made sense, but I feel like sometimes the umbrella term of dystopian doesn't always seem to describe books that technically are dystopians. I still don't think that made sense, but I'll explain it later. Honestly, for me, it's just a really intriguing concept that I want to do a full discussion on, because for me personally, a key factor of a dystopian, or books that I consider dystopians, are books where there's a corrupt government, and that's the key defining thing for me into dystopian, but I feel like that's not the case for a lot of things that I've seen labeled as dystopians. And I also feel like corrupt governments exist in a lot of other genres that aren't necessarily labeled as dystopian. So I'm rambling, but I really should do a discussion about this. And one of my personal favorite fantasy dystopian mixes is The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I love this book. I've talked it into the ground. It's fantastic. So moving on, I think that at this point, my #1 book turn-on is actually a term that I've made up to describe a thing that happens in books. So it's something that I have to look for in a description, but it is what I call the hidden traitor trope. I searched for an actual term for this and I didn't come up with one, so let me know if there's an actual term for this. But essentially, it's basically when one of the characters is secretly betraying the other one or is secretly the killer. So it's often in murder mystery novels, but it can also be present in novels outside of that. Obviously, the best example is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, in which there are 10 people on an island and they just start dying, and clearly one of these characters is killing everyone. So hidden traitor trope, or hidden murderer trope in this case. And this is a trope that's actually a lot more prevalent than I think I give it credit for, but I think that when I speak specifically about the hidden traitor trope, I mean it as in it's the central question to the novel, kind of like a whodunit novel. You're trying to figure out which of these characters is the person betraying everyone, and that's kind of the central theme of the novel, and that's when I really love it. Obviously it's present in so many other cases in which a character is secretly betraying everyone else, but when I really love it is when that's the central question to a book is which of these humans is lying to you, which of them is secretly betraying everyone else. That's when I really, really love it. Admittedly, it's a little cliche and it's definitely something that has been a little bit overdone, but I just really love it a lot, and that's part of the reason why I really enjoy murder mysteries, specifically Agatha Christie. And sometime in the near future, I'm planning to make an entire video talking about different pieces of media where the hidden traitor trope is really prevalent, not just books, but also TV shows, movies, stuff like that, because those are things that I really, really love and gravitate toward, and I want to make a video sharing all of those with y'all because It's like my favorite thing. Another thing that I absolutely love in books is multiple plot lines intricately woven together. So essentially following multiple characters, which on its own is something that I really, really love, and having those characters' plots like come together and then diverge. It's really interesting to see how these different plots can affect each other, and I just really, really enjoy that. For me, it just adds a ton of complexity to whatever story I'm reading, and it also is almost like I'm hunting for Easter eggs because I can see how one person's plot is influencing another's, or how their plots are eventually going to come together, or if they're together, how they're going to separate. It's really, really interesting. For me, one of my favorite books that does this the absolute best is The Diviners by Libba Bray. This series follows so many characters, and at first there's pretty much a central main character, but by the second book you're kind of following everyone equally, and it's just really interesting to see how their plot lines play off each other, even if some of them haven't even met yet. So yeah, when I see that a book has multiple main characters and that their plots are going to like weave together, sign me up. And this is one that I didn't even think about until now, but like 2 different timelines, that's also something that's really interesting to me. Any case where there are multiple plots that affect each other, super interesting. So the next 3 or so kind of play off each other, but I'm gonna start with this one, which is a lot of world building. I'm not as obsessed with world building as I was when I started on BookTube. I just really, really loved intricately built worlds, but world building is always something that's been really, really fascinating for me because, and this is the second like bullet point out of these 3, I have realized that I really, really like very slow and intriguing stories. So not necessarily like snail speed, but like I really enjoy taking time in a story and getting familiarized with the characters and the world and like taking time with that. So like that plays into the fact that I really, really love a lot of world building. Actually, there's a 4th point that's going to play into this in a moment, but we're going to move on to my original 3rd point, which is that I love when there are multiple / alternate worlds, because that means that I get even more time to learn about another world. It's just so fantastic. So I just love a ton of world building, and I like slower paced, more intriguing novels that take time to get to know the characters and the world. And I love having multiple worlds to learn about because it makes it that much more interesting to learn about another world with all of its own world building. And this plays into my 4th point, which I actually had lower down on the list, but I'm moving it to this section because it makes sense here. And it's that I tend to prefer books that are over 500 pages. And that is largely because you get more time to learn about the characters and the world. And even if it's not necessarily a slow-paced 500-page book, you still have more time to get to know these characters and to understand the world. And I just really love long books because I feel like I get more invested in what's going on and more engrossed and more invested in the characters, and I love big books. So since I hit on 4 points there, I'm gonna go back and hit on books that hit each of those points. So for me, a series that hits on both the point of a lot of world building and multiple worlds is, of course, the Pendragon series by DJ McHale. This is one of my favorite series of all time, and that's part of the reason why I really love it. There are 10 different territories in this series, and almost every book you're introduced to a new one, and it's just so fantastic to learn about these different worlds and lots of world building. And for a book specifically with a lot of great world building, I was going to shout out The Bone Season again, but I decided to choose a different book. The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, aka the first book in one of my all-time favorite series and my favorite book that I've read since Harry Potter. The world building in this book and this series are phenomenal, and Brandon Sanderson in general is phenomenal, and I just love his worlds. And then 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami is both a slow, intriguing read and also over 500 pages long. It is actually close to 1,200 pages, and it's just a really, really intriguing, pretty slow-paced read. Honestly, for the 500 pages plus buzzword, I could pick literally any big book on my shelves because I've never given a big book a bad rating. I think that I just really, really appreciate getting to spend time with characters and in a world. 500 plus page books just always get good ratings from me. My next bookish buzzword is musical characters slash themes. I am a musician, I have a degree in music, and whenever a book is really, really prominently centered around music, it makes me that much more interested in it. It's not necessarily that every musical book is like what I want to read, because there are so many books where music plays a really big role. But if it's a book I'm already interested in and I find out that it has a very prominent musical component, I'm sold. For me, the absolute best example of this is The Chimes by Anna Smale, which was a fantasy dystopian that I was super, super intrigued by, but it's also very centered around music, and music is actually a form of communication in this world. And as you can see, the cover has like the violin on the front. It's just everything that I love. And so when I heard that this had a musical element to it, I was sold, and it's so good. The next bookish buzzword on my list is the most vague one probably, and that is just books with dark themes in general. And I'm not necessarily meaning like creepy horror, but like just generally darker themed. So like murder mysteries, or books with an overall dark tone to them, like mysterious, intriguing, like stuff like that is what I'm really, really gravitating toward. Murder mysteries especially, but like just anything with a darker theme has been like stuff that I've been more interested in lately than like cute contemporary novels, even though I still do enjoy those. And recently a dark novel that I've read is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I really, really enjoyed this one. It just in general has a kind of dark vibe to it, and it deals with some dark subject matters. It's just very fascinating and definitely dark. The next bookish buzzword is actually like a combination of four, but essentially boarding school books, magic school books, books set in college, and just like dark academia in general. All of those are things that I definitely gravitate toward. It used to be that I would gravitate more towards specifically magic school books, but lately it's just been anything that is prominently set within a school, whether that's a high school like boarding school or whether that is like a college. It's definitely something that I'm very, very inclined to pick up. Even something like A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness, which isn't necessarily set at a college. It deals with someone who's getting her PhD, and it's set at Oxford. So like it still is kind of in that realm, and just anything dealing with like academia in general is something that I've been really, really intrigued by lately. In fact, recently I think I've actually been gravitating more toward books with a like general college setting or like a boarding school setting than specifically magic school. One of these books that I absolutely loved was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I loved the dark academia aspect to this. It's like a really tight-knit group of college students who spend all of their time like in their like studio studying and in their dorm room together. And I don't know, just something about like that setting at a college and like the somewhat pretentiousness of the students is something that I'm just really gravitating toward recently. I don't know. This is also very similar to The Secret History, so like check out both of them. Another thing that really intrigues me in books but doesn't always necessarily work out for me is unique formatting. And I'm not talking necessarily like visual novels, but anything where like it's like case files versus just normal text, or like anything where the formatting of the book is atypical. It really, really intrigues me. That said, lately this hasn't really been working out for me, so I'm starting to kind of shy away from this just a little bit, like Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. I didn't really get that drawn into it. I read, I think, the first like 20% of it, and it just wasn't grabbing me, and so I have unhauled it at this point. I still have the audiobook, so like maybe I'll get back to it, but like this is definitely a trope that I immediately gravitate toward, but I've realized that I need to be a little bit more selective with which one of them I actually choose to read, because it doesn't always work out for me. But it does always immediately interest me, and I'm definitely more inclined to pick up a book if I find that it has interesting formatting. And finally, the last one on the positive side is one that I've kind of already mentioned very briefly, but I'm going to talk about it very briefly again, and that is Corrupt Government. Like I said when I talked about dystopia, this for me is kind of my marker of dystopia. Like, I consider dystopian novels ones where there is a corrupt government, because it's all about dystopia versus utopia, and obviously utopia is kind of just the same thing but different. I'm rambling. But For me, the marker of dystopia is a corrupt government, and therefore, since I love dystopia, corrupt governments are things that I really, really find myself drawn to. So yeah, regardless of what form of like government it is, whenever it's like a corrupt government, that triggers my like dystopia excitement, and therefore it's something that I really love. And this is present in something like Ready Player One, where it's kind of more of a company that's corrupt, but still love it. It's also present in the Mistborn trilogy, but like I've already used that as an example, so we're moving on. Okay, so now moving on to book turn-offs. I only have 3, and these kind of range from like, these are the types of books I don't like to read, to like, if a book I'm interested in has this thing, it dissuades me from reading it a bit. So let's go ahead and jump into these 3 topics. So the first of these is that if a book has under 3.5 stars on Goodreads, I typically just don't read it. And I get that this is probably a kind of controversial one because maybe I'm relying on other reviewers too much, but I've realized that I tend to be slightly more critical than the average Goodreads rating. And so if the general consensus on a book is that the most commonly given rating is a 3, I probably will like it even less than that. And there are books that I have read and loved that have under 3.5 stars on Goodreads, but those are like notable exceptions to the rule. And I sometimes break this rule, not very often, but it's mostly just because I don't want to waste my time on something that I already kind of have a negative opinion on going into it. And honestly, for me, picking up books that have less than 4 stars on Goodreads is still sometimes questionable. Like, I regularly pick up books that have less than 4 stars on Goodreads, don't get me wrong. But like, I always feel more interested in and excited about books when I know that they have over 4 stars on Goodreads, because it's one that people have a general consensus that this is a good book. And obviously I don't want to bash books that have less than 4 stars, but it's just, I know my own reading tastes, and I know that I tend to be generally more critical than the majority of people on Goodreads. So when a lot of people on Goodreads give lower ratings to books, it makes me skeptical that I'm going to like it, and it already gives me a negative opinion going into the book, which is just not a good way to go into a book. And for me, a notable exception to this rule is The Chimes by Anna Smale. It was longlisted for the Man Booker, and I guess that a lot of people read it and didn't think that it should have been longlisted for the Man Booker. I don't know. A lot of people didn't enjoy it. I really did. I loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I already talked about loving it earlier in this video, but there are exceptions, just not enough for the rule to not be mostly true for me. To be honest, maybe I should just stop consulting Goodreads in general before I go into a book, just because it can taint my view of it. But when I do see the rating, that's typically what I think, is that under 3.5, I tend to just not pick it up, and sometimes below 4 is questionable, but I still pick them up quite often. So these next 2 are not really ones that dissuade me from reading a book I'm interested in, but they're more just like general things that I don't like in books. So the first of those is that I do not gravitate toward, nor do I typically tend to enjoy, historical fiction books that have no fantasy or paranormal elements. It took me a while to kind of figure out why I don't really enjoy historical fiction, but it comes down to 2 pretty simple topics, and that is, 1, old-fashioned speech just for some reason gets on my nerves. I don't know what it is, I don't know why, but I definitely, even in like books with paranormal or fantastical elements, it's still something that I have to like get myself through and like cope with, because it's just not something I really enjoy for some reason. And the second one of those is like social issues and like the way women are treated and the way minorities, and it just like the way that people were treated in the past really sucks. And that's a large reason why I don't enjoy historical stories a lot of the time. And to be honest, this is really why I love Libba Bray so much, because yes, she writes historical fiction and it does have the old-fashioned speech that I hate, but she does such a good job of having diverse novels where people are not marginalized, and if they are, it's like not okay. So like, I love Libba Bray's books, and she of course has historical fiction with paranormal elements, so like, I love her. She's like the notable exception to like my historical fiction rule, but like it does have paranormal elements, so I guess it's not an exception. I don't know, I'm rambling. And finally, the last one that is kind of a bit of a turnoff for me in books is that I realized that there are certain subgenres of fantasy that I just don't really like, nor do I gravitate toward. And I said this in my other video this week, but I had to like specifically look up the terminology because there are so many vague subgenres to fantasy. So I'm sorry if these like terms don't actually fit what I'm talking about, but essentially these genres of fantasy that I'm talking about are epic fantasy, sword and sorcery, and historical fantasy. And when I was really sitting down and thinking about this, I kind of started to realize that the type of fantasy I'm really interested in is like the type of fantasy where there are small or one-on-one battles of magic versus giant armies fighting with swords. And in the other video I made this week, I mentioned kind of like Mistborn versus The Way of Kings. Like, Mistborn is one of my favorite series of all time, and it deals largely with a singular character and the magic system and a lot of smaller or one-on-one battles of magic, whereas a lot of The Way of Kings for me was centered around like epic battles where people were physically fighting. And it's been a year and a half since I read it, so like, don't get mad at me if that's like a little bit of an overstatement, but like the parts of The Way of Kings that I really loved were the sections with Shalyn, I think is how you pronounce her name, where she's like learning about magic and she's in the library. Like, that's the type of stuff that I found really intriguing in that story versus like the giant sword battles. Like, I enjoy magic based and like individual based fantasy versus giant epic battles. So yes, The Lord of the Rings isn't necessarily like my favorite thing on the entire planet, but it's something that I do find somewhat interesting. I'm sorry if I just crushed all of your hopes and dreams, but I find magic systems really interesting, and I like little magical battles versus giant armies going at each other. So that is it for my bookish buzzwords and like my few bookish turnoffs. I'm sure that there are things that I'm forgetting or just not thinking about, so maybe I'll make another one of these in the future. But that is it for today. Let me know some of your personal bookish buzzwords down in the comments. As always, I will leave links down in the description to my blog, Twitter, and Goodreads. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I would love to be friends with all of you. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!